It started with a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday. Not a mankind will remember this day forever kind of Tuesday. You had cold coffee, 3 unread emails from your university department head, and a grant proposal due in 6 hours. And then your centrifuge beeped. You'd been working on it for 11 years. Prehistoric DNA reconstruction. The kind of research other scientists call theoretically interesting at conferences and then laugh about in the parking lot. You had a whiteboard covered in equations nobody else understood, and a lab that smelled permanently of formaldehyde and ambition. The egg on your workbench was the size of a watermelon, pale gray, slightly warm to the touch. You hadn't meant to get this far. The DNA strand you'd reconstructed belonged to a Spinosaurus, the largest carnivorous dinosaur to ever walk the earth. Bigger than T-Rex, bigger than anything, 17 meters long, 7 to 9 tons. A skull nearly 6 feet from end to end. It hunted in rivers, moved like a crocodile, and had a sail of 7-foot spines running down its back like a crown nobody asked for. You named the project S1, very professional.
Wow.
You named the egg Gerald. Gerald hatched on a Wednesday morning. You were eating a granola bar when it happened. One crack, then another, and then a tiny oil-slick snout pushed through the shell and sneezed directly onto your lab coat. It was, objectively, the cutest thing you had ever seen. He was the size of a Labrador, dark green scales, enormous eyes, tiny useless arms waving at nothing. He made a sound somewhere between a purr and a hiss. You gave him a fish from the tank in the corner of the lab. He ate it in one bite and looked at you like you were the most important thing in the world. You named him Gerald officially that afternoon. You told yourself it was for documentation purposes. The first month was chaos. Gerald grew fast. Faster than your models predicted. You'd come in at 7 a.m. and he'd be 3 inches longer than the night before. He knocked over your bookshelf twice. He ate through your Ethernet cable. He followed you around the lab with the focused devotion of a golden retriever who happened to be a prehistoric apex predator. You brought him fish. He brought you things he found impressive. A stapler, a broken Bunsen burner, one of your shoes. By month 3, Gerald was the size of a pickup truck. You told yourself this was manageable. The university found out about Gerald in month 4, after he pushed through a wall looking for you during a fire drill. There were meetings, there were forms. There was a strongly worded letter from the ethics board that used the phrase catastrophic liability 14 times. You moved operations to your private facility outside the city. Gerald seemed to like it there. More space, a pond, trees to knock over when he was bored. You kept a log. Scientific observations, feeding schedules, behavioral notes. But somewhere between week 19 and week 24, the log entries started sounding less like science and more like a parent bragging at a dinner party. You knew it couldn't last. You'd run the growth projections. Full adult Spinosaurus, 14 to 18 meters long. Weight estimates pushing past 7,000 kilograms. You had a timeline. You knew what was coming. You just didn't want to look at it. Month 7, Gerald stopped eating fish. He'd been putting away 200 kilograms of salmon a day without complaint. Then one morning, he didn't touch his tank. He paced the perimeter of the facility instead, back and forth, back and forth. His sail, that impossible ridge of spines down his back, had grown to full height. 7 feet of prehistoric architecture, flushing deep red when he was agitated. He was agitated. By month 8, he was gone. He'd pushed through the reinforced outer fence like it was cardboard. You stood at the gap in the wire at 5 a.m. with a flashlight, staring into the dark, and you understood with perfect scientific clarity that you had made a significant miscalculation. The military found him 3 days later, 40 miles south, standing in a river and eating livestock. They sent helicopters. The helicopters didn't help. His hide absorbed impact the way a wall absorbs rain. Missiles redirected around that sail like it was designed to survive them. He didn't even look up. They tried everything modern weapons technology had to offer. Gerald didn't notice. Cities went dark in sequence. He moved along the coast, following river systems the way his species had 100 million years ago, as if the world had simply been rearranged slightly and he was relearning the map. Infrastructure collapsed behind him. The news stopped covering individual incidents because there were too many to count. The call from the government came on a Thursday. They'd read your papers, all 11 years of them. They knew you were the only person alive who understood what Gerald was, how he thought, what he responded to. They didn't ask you to destroy him. They told you it was the only option left. You went back to the lab. The whiteboard was still there. The cold coffee. The old grant proposal you'd never submitted. You stood at the workbench where Gerald had hatched and you started working. The compound took you 6 weeks. A sedative built from Gerald's own DNA, something that could only work on him, something only you could have designed. You loaded it into a modified tranquilizer delivery system the size of a small car. You drove it yourself to the coast, where he'd last been spotted. You found him in an estuary at dawn, still and enormous against the water, that red sail catching the early light. You called his name. He turned. And for a moment, just a moment, those eyes found yours across the water. The same enormous, oil-dark eyes that had blinked at you from inside a cracked egg on a Wednesday morning. The same creature that had waited by the gate for 4 hours, that had brought you a stapler as a gift. You fired the delivery system. It worked. Of course it worked. You'd built it. Gerald sat down slowly, the way mountains sit down. The estuary shook, his head lowered into the water, and then was still. The sail lost its color. The government called it a success. The news called it a victory for humanity. There were press conferences and medals and official statements about science and responsibility. You drove home alone and sat on the floor of the lab for a long time. The fish tank was still running. The stapler was still on your desk where he'd left it. There was a claw mark down the left wall from month 2, when he'd been the size of a truck and thought your filing cabinet was a toy. You had your log, 47 weeks of entries, growth charts, feeding records, behavioral data. And somewhere in the middle of it, a line you'd written at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in month 3, when Gerald had fallen asleep with his snout pressed against the lab door so you couldn't leave without waking him. He just wants to know where I am. You were the one who brought him back. You were the one who named him. And you were the one who had to let him go. 11 years of research. 1 Tuesday. 1 egg. 1 mistake that you would spend the rest of your life being completely unable to regret.